The room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Under the harsh white lights of New Dawn Public Hospital, Janet Akinyi screamed as her body trembled on the narrow bed, her hands clutching her stomach as if she could still protect what was already slipping away. Blood stained the sheets, machines beeped wildly, nurses shouted for help. At the doorway stood Bright Ofori, a billionaire who owned half the city. Yet in this moment, he was powerless, frozen, staring at the truth he never knew existed. 2 innocent lives were fading, and the man responsible was his own son. But how did it come to this? Before we begin this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to subscribe. Long before pain filled a hospital room, before blood and regret rewrote destiny, Janet Akinyi lived a life so quiet that the world barely noticed her existence. Every morning before sunrise, she woke up on a thin foam mattress in a cramped one-room shack at the edge of the city. The corrugated iron roof rattled whenever the wind passed through, and the smell of damp earth clung to the air. Janet would sit up slowly, whisper a short prayer, then begin her day without complaint. There was no mirror in her room, but she knew her face well enough. Soft eyes, tired but kind, the face of someone who had learned to endure more than she should have at such a young age. By 6 o'clock, she was already on the bus heading toward the wealthy side of the city where streets were clean, trees were trimmed, and people like her were expected to remain invisible. That was where the Ofori mansion stood. Massive iron gates guarded the property. Beyond them stretched manicured lawns, marble floors, and silence, the kind of silence money buys. Janet had been working there for nearly 2 years as a live-out maid. She cleaned, washed, cooked, and kept her head down. That was the rule. Speak only when spoken to, move quickly, never look anyone in the eyes for too long, especially not Madame Sophia Ofori. Sophia was the second wife of Bright Ofori, and she carried herself like a queen who believed the poor existed only to serve her. She never raised her voice, but her words were sharp enough to cut. "Janet," she would say, clicking her tongue impatiently. "Why is there dust on this table? Do I have to remind you of your job every day?" Janet would bow her head. "I'm sorry, madam. I'll clean it again." No matter how spotless the house was, it was never enough. Janet learned early that perfection did not protect you when someone had already decided you were beneath them. The only reason Janet endured it all was simple: she needed the money. After losing her mother years ago, she had survived by taking whatever work she could find. The Ofori mansion paid more than most places, and that small salary meant she could send a little money to her friend Zuri Otieno, and avoid sleeping hungry. For a long time, Janet believed her life would remain this way, hard, quiet, invisible. Until Mukhtar Ofori returned home. He came back from abroad like a storm wrapped in expensive cologne and arrogance. The only son of Bright Ofori, Mukhtar was known in elite circles as charming, reckless, and untouchable. He drove cars worth more than Janet could earn in 10 lifetimes. Wherever he went, people laughed louder, smiled harder, and forgave faster. Janet first noticed him when she was mopping the hallway outside the study. He walked past her without slowing down, speaking into his phone. But then he stopped, turned around, looked at her not the way others did, like she was furniture, but with curiosity. "What's your name?" he asked casually. Janet froze. No one in the family ever asked her name. "Janet, sir," she replied softly, eyes fixed on the floor. He smiled. "Janet," he repeated as if tasting the sound. "You've been here long?" "Almost 2 years, sir." He nodded, then walked away. It should have ended there. It should have meant nothing. But from that day on, Mukhtar began to notice her more. Sometimes he would ask her to bring him water instead of calling another staff member. Other times he would comment on how quiet she was, how polite. At first, Janet thought she was imagining it. Surely a man like him wouldn't see someone like her, but attention, even dangerous attention, feels warm when you've been cold for too long. One evening, he caught her alone in the kitchen after dinner. "You work too hard," Mukhtar said, leaning against the counter. "Does my stepmother ever let you rest?" Janet hesitated. I'm just doing my job, sir." He laughed softly. "Relax. I'm not my father, or her." That was the first time he spoke to her like she was human. From then on, their conversations became longer. Mukhtar asked about her life, where she came from, whether she had family. Janet answered carefully, afraid of saying too much, but he listened. Or at least he acted like he did. "You're different from the others here," he told her once. "You don't beg. You don't complain." Janet didn't know whether that was a compliment or an observation, but her heart betrayed her anyway. She had never been courted before. No one had ever looked at her and seen potential instead of poverty, and Mukhtar knew exactly how to use that. He began to offer small kindnesses. Extra food from the fridge, money slipped quietly into her hand. "Buy yourself something nice," he said once. Janet tried to refuse. "I can't take this." "Don't be proud," he replied gently. "Let me help you." Help! That word echoed in her mind for days. Against her better judgment, Janet allowed herself to believe that maybe this man was different. Maybe he wasn't like the others who used power only to crush. She didn't see the warning signs. Or perhaps she did, but hope blinded her. Because when you've lived your whole life with nothing, even a lie can feel like a miracle. And that was how the door opened. Not with force, not with violence, but with a smile, a promise, and a power imbalance Janet didn't yet understand. The change did not happen all at once. It arrived slowly, quietly, like a shadow stretching longer each day without Janet noticing where the light had gone. After Mukhtar Ofori began speaking to her, Janet found herself moving through the mansion differently. She was still careful, still obedient, but her heart no longer felt as heavy. There was a strange warmth in knowing that someone, even someone like him, had seen her. Not as a maid, not as a burden, but as a person. At least that was what she believed. Mukhtar had a way of appearing when no one else was around, in the hallway just before dusk, in the kitchen when the other staff had gone home, once even in the garden at night when the lights were low and the city hummed softly beyond the walls. "You should sit," he said one evening, pulling out a chair for her in the empty dining room. "You've been on your feet all day." Janet hesitated, her hands tightening around the tray she was holding. "I'm not allowed, sir." He smiled. "You're allowed when I say so." She sat. They talked about small things at first: music, food, the places he had traveled to, the places she had never seen. Mukhtar spoke with confidence, with ease, like someone who had never worried about tomorrow. Janet listened wide-eyed, absorbing stories that felt like they belonged to another universe. "Do you know what it's like?" he asked one night, swirling the drink in his glass, to be surrounded by people but never really trusted. Janet frowned. "I thought rich people had everything." He laughed bitterly. "That's what everyone thinks." That was the moment she felt something shift inside her. Pity, perhaps, or understanding. She had spent her life believing people like Mukhtar were untouchable, immune to loneliness. Hearing him speak of emptiness made him feel human. And Mukhtar noticed. He leaned closer, lowered his voice, shared pieces of himself that felt intimate, personal. Whether they were true or carefully chosen lies, Janet could not tell. "You don't look at me the way others do," he said once, "like you're trying to get something from me." Janet shook her head. "I wouldn't dare. I wish more people were like you." Those words followed her long after she returned to her small room that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his voice in her mind. She told herself to be careful. She told herself this could only end badly. But hope is a stubborn thing. Soon the kindness became more deliberate. Mukhtar began to shield her from Madame Sophia's anger. If Janet was late with a task, he intervened. If Sophia complained, he dismissed it. "Leave her alone," he told his stepmother once. "She works harder than anyone here." Madame Sophia's eyes narrowed. "You're getting too familiar with the help." Janet overheard that conversation from the corridor. Her stomach twisted. She knew then that something dangerous was unfolding. She tried to pull away. The next time Mukhtar asked her to stay and talk, she declined. "I'm tired, sir. I should go." He looked surprised, then amused. "Are you avoiding me?" "No," she said quickly. I don't want trouble." Mukhtar studied her for a moment. "Do you think I would let anything happen to you?" She wanted to believe him. The night it happened, the mansion was unusually quiet. Bright Ofori was away on business. Madame Sophia had gone to visit friends. The staff had been dismissed early. Janet was finishing her last task when Mukhtar appeared at the doorway. "I need your help," he said. "With what, sir? My room. I can't find something." Her heart began to race. She hesitated only for a second before following him upstairs. The room smelled of expensive perfume and polished wood. Mukhtar closed the door behind them. Not loudly, not forcefully, just enough to make the air feel heavy. "Relax," he said, sensing her tension. You look scared." "I'm not scared," Janet replied, though her voice betrayed her. He stepped closer. "You trust me, don't you?" She didn't answer. Mukhtar reached out, touching her hand lightly. "I'd never hurt you." In that moment, Janet stood at the edge of a choice she didn't fully understand. She thought of her life of endless cleaning, of hunger, of being unseen. She thought of the warmth she felt when he spoke to her like she mattered, and she let herself believe. What followed was quiet. No shouting, no struggle, just confusion, hope, and a power imbalance that Janet would only recognize much later. The next morning, Mukhtar was gone. Janet returned to work, her mind foggy, her body sore. Mukhtar avoided her for days. When he finally spoke to her again, it was brief, distant. "You should keep this to yourself," he said flatly. "It wouldn't look good for either of us." Her heart sank. "I thought—" He cut her off. "Don't think too much." That was when fear replaced hope. Weeks passed. Janet felt sick most mornings, dizzy, weak. She told herself it was stress, exhaustion, anything but the truth she was too afraid to face. Until one afternoon when she fainted in the laundry room. At the clinic, the nurse looked at her chart, then at her face. "How far along do you think you are?" Janet stared at her. "Along with what?" The nurse sighed gently. "You're pregnant." The world tilted. When the doctor returned with the results, his expression grew serious. "There's something else," he said. "You're carrying twins." Janet's hands flew to her mouth. Twins. 2 lives growing inside her. Fragile, innocent. Fear washed over her, followed by something unexpected: joy. A quiet, trembling joy that made tears fill her eyes. She went home that night, sitting on her mattress in the dark, her hands resting on her stomach. She whispered to the lives inside her, promising to protect them. The next day she told Mukhtar. His face drained of color. "What did you say?" he asked. "I'm pregnant," Janet repeated softly, "with twins." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he laughed, short, sharp, humorless. "You must be joking." "I'm not." "You're lying," he snapped. "This can't happen." Janet reached out to him. "I don't want anything from you. I just thought you should know." Mukhtar pulled away. "You don't understand what you've done," he said coldly. "This will destroy everything." In that instant, Janet realized she had never truly known him, and the trap she had stepped into was already closing. After that conversation, nothing in Janet Akinyi's life felt steady anymore. Mukhtar Ofori did not shout. He did not insult her. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, he became someone else entirely, cold, distant, unreachable. He stopped looking at her. When their paths crossed in the hallway, he passed by as if she were a stranger, as if she were air. Janet felt the change immediately. The mansion, once merely silent, now felt hostile. Every polished surface reflected her fear back at her. Every footstep echoed too loudly. She moved through her duties like a ghost, her hands shaking as she cleaned rooms she no longer felt safe in. At night, alone in her small room, she pressed her palms against her stomach, searching for comfort. "It will be okay," she whispered to herself. "I will find a way." But the truth was, she had no idea how. Her body began to change. Morning sickness became a constant companion. The smell of food made her gag. Her uniform grew tight around her waist, and she started wearing loose sweaters to hide the subtle curve forming beneath the fabric. Every day she lived in fear that someone would notice. She avoided Madame Sophia as much as possible. The woman's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Why are you moving so slowly these days?" Sophia snapped one afternoon. "Are you lazy now or just careless?" "I'm sorry," Madame Janet replied, lowering her head. "I'm not feeling very well." "Then don't bring your weakness into my house," Sophia said. "If you can't work, I'll find someone who can." Janet nodded, swallowing hard. Losing this job would mean losing everything. She wanted to talk to someone, anyone. But who could she trust? Zuri lived far away, and Janet was ashamed to tell her the truth. Pastor Daniel Mwangi would listen, she knew that, but fear kept her silent. Speaking the truth would make it real. Meanwhile, Mukhtar watched from a distance. He noticed the way Janet avoided his eyes, the way her body had begun to change, the way she flinched whenever his stepmother raised her voice. And with every passing day, his panic grew. This was not part of his plan. To Mukhtar, that night had been nothing more than a moment of indulgence, a mistake he believed money and silence could erase. He had never considered consequences, never imagined responsibility. Now, everything he valued felt threatened: his reputation, his inheritance, his future. He confronted Janet again one evening, cornering her near the storage room where no one could hear them. "You need to fix this," he said, his voice low and urgent. Janet looked at him, tears already forming. "Fix what?" "This pregnancy," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what will happen if my father finds out?" Her heart pounded. "They're children, Mukhtar. They're innocent." He laughed bitterly. "Innocent doesn't matter in the real world." She shook her head slowly. "I'm not asking you for money or marriage. I just want to keep them." His eyes hardened. "You don't get to want things anymore." The cruelty of that sentence hit her like a slap. "You used to say you cared?" Janet whispered. "I said what I needed to say," he replied. "Now listen carefully. You will go to a doctor, you will end this, and then you will disappear." Janet stepped back as if he had struck her. "I can't," she said. "I won't." Mukhtar leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You think you have a choice. You live in my father's house, you work for my family. One word from me and you'll be out on the street." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Please, don't do this. Think about your life," he said coldly. "Think about how easily it can fall apart." That night, Janet cried until her chest hurt. She cried for the children she already loved, for the girl she used to be, hopeful, naive, trusting, for the mistake she could not undo. Days passed. Mukhtar continued to pressure her, sometimes with threats, sometimes with promises. "I'll give you money," he said one day, pressing an envelope into her hand. "Enough to start over." She pushed it back toward him. "I don't want your money." "You'll want it when you're homeless," he replied sharply. Janet's health began to decline. Stress weighed heavily on her body. She felt dizzy often, and sharp pains shot through her lower abdomen. Still, she forced herself to work, terrified of drawing attention. It was during a routine cleaning that everything nearly collapsed. Madame Sophia walked into the room unexpectedly and froze, her eyes locking onto Janet's midsection. "What is that?" she demanded. Janet's heart stopped. Nothing, madam," she stammered instinctively, pulling the cloth she was holding closer to her body. Sophia stepped forward, her expression darkening. "Are you pregnant?" The room spun. Janet couldn't speak. Sophia's lips curled in disgust. "How dare you bring such shame into my house? I didn't plan. Who is responsible?" Sophia hissed. Janet remained silent, her hands trembling. Sophia laughed cruelly. "Of course. You think sleeping with rich men will lift you out of poverty." "That's not true," Janet cried. "Please, madam, I beg you." Sophia turned away, already reaching for her phone. "This will not stain my family." Later that night, Janet was summoned to the sitting room. Mukhtar was there. So was Sophia. Sophia spoke first. "You will not continue this pregnancy while living under my roof." Janet looked at Mukhtar, searching for any trace of the man who had once smiled at her. He said nothing. "You will leave this house," Sophia continued, "or you will do what is necessary." Janet's knees buckled. "Where will I go?" Sophia shrugged. "That is not my concern." Janet realized then that she was completely alone. She packed her few belongings that night. As she walked out through the massive iron gates, rain began to fall, soaking her clothes, blurring her vision. She did not look back. With nowhere else to go, Janet returned to the only place that would take her, the slums where Zuri lived. When Zuri opened the door and saw her friend standing there drenched and shaking, she pulled her inside without a word. Only then did Janet finally break down. Between sobs, she told Zuri everything. The lies, the pregnancy, the twins. Zuri held her tightly. "You're not alone anymore," she said fiercely. "We'll face this together." For the first time since learning the truth, Janet felt a fragile sense of relief. But far away inside the mansion she had just been cast out from, Mukhtar Ofori sat alone in his room, staring at the rain streaking down the window. He told himself this was necessary. He told himself this would all be over soon. He had no idea that the choices he was making were already setting karma in motion. Life in the slums did not soften its blows for anyone, not even for a pregnant woman carrying twins. Janet Akinyi learned that quickly. Zuri Otieno's room was barely larger than a storage closet. 2 narrow mattresses lay on the floor, separated by a thin strip of cracked concrete. When Janet arrived, soaked from the rain and shaking with exhaustion, Zuri did not hesitate. She shared her space, her food, and her silence. For the first few days, Janet barely spoke. She slept, woke up crying, slept again. Her body ached, and the weight of what she had lost, her job, her safety, her dignity, pressed heavily on her chest. Zuri watched her closely. You need to rest, she said one morning, placing a cup of warm water in Janet's hands. You're carrying 2 lives now. You can't break. Janet looked down at her stomach, her eyes filling with tears. I'm trying to be strong, she whispered, but I don't know if I can. Zuri squeezed her hand. You already are. But strength did not pay hospital bills. Strength did not buy food. And strength did not protect Janet from the shadow Mukhtar Afori continued to cast over her life. 2 weeks after Janet was thrown out of the mansion, a man appeared near the slum entrance asking for her by name. He was well-dressed, clean, out of place. Zuri's instincts flared immediately. Who are you? I have a message, the man replied calmly, from Mr. Mukhtar Afori. Janet's heart dropped into her stomach. She stepped forward slowly. What does he want? The man handed her an envelope. He wants you to consider an offer. Inside the envelope was money, more money than Janet had ever seen at once. Her hands trembled. What is this for? So you can do the right thing? The man replied without emotion. Janet felt sick. That night she barely slept. She stared at the envelope lying between her and Zuri like a venomous snake waiting to strike. He thinks he can buy you, Zuri said angrily. Don't let him. I don't want his money, Janet replied softly. But what if I can't protect them? The fear she had been holding back finally spilled out. She was hungry, weak. Her body hurt constantly. She worried about the babies every hour. The next morning, Janet felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen. She doubled over, gasping. Zuri panicked. We're going to the hospital, now. They rushed to New Dawn Public Hospital, where Nurse Abena Mensah examined Janet with a concerned expression. You're under severe stress, Abena said gently. With twins, this is dangerous. You need rest, proper nutrition, prenatal care. Janet swallowed hard. I don't have money. Abena sighed. We'll do what we can. Later that day, as Janet lay on the narrow hospital bed, weak and frightened, the last person she wanted to see walked into the room. Mukhtar Afori. He looked irritated, not concerned. His expensive shoes gleamed against the cracked hospital floor. So this is where you ran off to, he said. Janet turned her face away. Mukhtar stepped closer. You're making this harder than it needs to be. She looked at him, then her eyes burning. Harder for who? For me, he replied honestly. You think my father can never find out? You think rumors don't travel? These are your children, she said, her voice shaking. How can you talk like this? He exhaled sharply. Don't start that again. He pulled out documents from his bag and placed them on the bed. I've arranged everything. A doctor, a procedure. You sign these and it's done. Janet stared at the papers, her vision blurring. You want me to kill them? Don't be dramatic, Mukhtar snapped. They're not even born. They are alive, she whispered fiercely. I feel them. Mukhtar leaned closer, lowering his voice. Listen to me carefully, Janet. If you don't do this, your life will get much worse. I can make sure no hospital treats you. No landlord rents to you. No charity helps you. She trembled. You wouldn't. He looked her straight in the eye. Try me. Nurse Abena entered the room just then, sensing the tension. Sir, visiting hours are... Mukhtar cut her off. This is a private matter. Abena's eyes flicked to Janet's tear-streaked face. She needs rest. Mukhtar scoffed. She needs to make a decision. He turned back to Janet. You have 2 days. Then he walked out. Janet collapsed into sobs the moment he left. Nurse Abena sat beside her, resting a comforting hand on her arm. You're not alone, she said quietly. Whatever you decide, we'll support you. But Janet knew the truth. Support did not equal protection. That night, Pastor Daniel Mwangi came to see her. Zuri had called him in desperation. Pastor Daniel listened without interrupting as Janet told her story, every detail, every threat, every fear. When she finished, he spoke softly. No one has the right to force you to destroy life. But what if I can't keep them safe? Janet asked, her voice breaking. What if he's right? Pastor Daniel looked at her steadily. Evil always sounds powerful until it meets courage. 2 days passed like a slow execution. Janet's body grew weaker. The pain returned sharper this time. She struggled to eat. Fear clawed at her mind. On the 3rd morning, Mukhtar returned. I'm out of patience, he said coldly. Sign the papers. Janet looked at him, then at the window where sunlight filtered weakly through dusty glass. I won't, she said. Mukhtar's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. Maybe she replied. But it's my mistake to make. His face hardened. Then don't say I didn't warn you. That night, Janet's condition worsened. She began bleeding. Zuri screamed for help as nurses rushed in. Janet cried out, clutching her stomach, begging silently for her babies to survive. Outside the ward, Mukhtar stood watching through the glass, his expression unreadable. And somewhere deep inside him, something twisted, but not enough to stop him. Because sometimes karma doesn't wait for the future. Sometimes it begins immediately. The night Janet Akinyi lost her home for the second time, the rain returned as if the sky itself had chosen a side. It began softly, small drops tapping against the rusted roof of the hospital's emergency wing. Then it grew louder, heavier, until the sound drowned out Janet's cries inside the ward. Nurses rushed back and forth. Shoes squeaked against wet floors. Someone shouted for more gauze. Someone else called for the doctor. Janet lay curled on the narrow bed, her hands clenched into the sheets, her body trembling with pain and terror. Blood soaked through the thin hospital blanket. Her breathing came in shallow, broken gasps. "Please, please," she whispered, not sure who she was speaking to anymore. "Don't take them. I'll do anything." Nurse Abena Mensah stayed by her side, wiping sweat from Janet's forehead. "Stay with me," she said firmly. "Breathe. Look at me." Dr. Kofi Adam arrived moments later, his face tense as he examined Janet quickly. "She's hemorrhaging," he said. "We need to stabilize her now." Outside the ward, Zuri paced back and forth, wringing her hands, her clothes soaked from the rain. Pastor Daniel Mwangi stood beside her, murmuring prayers under his breath. And just down the hallway, leaning against the wall, as if he were waiting for a business meeting to end, stood Mukhtar Ofori. He checked his watch. Every minute that passed made him more anxious, not because Janet was suffering, but because the situation was slipping out of his control. This was not how he wanted it handled. This was messy, public, dangerous. When Dr. Kofi stepped out briefly to give instructions, Mukhtar intercepted him. Dr. Mukhtar said calmly, "I'm responsible for this patient." Dr. Kofi frowned. "She's in critical condition." "I understand," Mukhtar replied. "I want this resolved quietly." The doctor stiffened. "My priority is her life." Mukhtar lowered his voice. "And mine is making sure this doesn't become a scandal." Dr. Kofi met his gaze. "I don't negotiate with pressure." Mukhtar's lips curled slightly. "Everyone negotiates. You just haven't heard the right offer yet." Before the doctor could respond, Nurse Abena called out urgently, "Doctor, we're losing her blood pressure." Mukhtar stepped back, irritation flashing across his face. He watched as the medical team rushed inside again, the door closing firmly in his face. For the first time that night, something close to fear touched him. An hour later, the doors opened. Dr. Kofi walked out slowly, removing his gloves. His expression was heavy. Zuri rushed forward. "How is she?" "The babies." Dr. Kofi shook his head gently. "I'm sorry." Zuri's knees buckled. Pastor Daniel caught her before she fell. Mukhtar straightened. "What do you mean?" Zuri sobbed. Both of them. Dr. Kofi closed his eyes briefly. "Yes, Janet had lost the twins." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Mukhtar let out a slow breath. Relief washed over him before he could stop it. The problem, his problem, was gone. He turned away without saying a word. Inside the ward, Janet lay still, her face pale, her eyes open but empty. Nurse Abena sat beside her, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," Abena whispered. "We tried everything." Janet did not cry. She did not scream. She stared at the ceiling, her lips moving soundlessly. Something inside her had gone quiet. When she was finally discharged the next day, weak and barely able to stand, there was no one waiting with flowers, no one offering comfort, only Zuri and Pastor Daniel holding her up as she walked out into the gray morning. They returned to the slum together. The narrow room that once felt crowded now felt unbearably empty. Janet sat on the mattress and stared at the wall for hours. She did not eat. She did not speak. Zuri knelt beside her. "Janet, say something, please." Janet swallowed hard. "They're gone," she whispered. "I couldn't protect them." Zuri wrapped her arms around her. "This wasn't your fault." But Janet shook her head slowly. "I let him into my life." That same afternoon, far across the city, Madame Sophia Ofori sat in the grand sitting room of the mansion sipping tea. Mukhtar stood before her, silent. "Well," she asked coolly. "Is it finished?" "Yes," Mukhtar replied. Sophia nodded. "Good. That girl was a stain. Mukhtar felt a flicker of unease but ignored it. "Make sure she never comes near this house again," Sophia continued. "I don't want to hear her name." Mukhtar left the room without replying. 2 days later, Bright Ofori returned from his business trip. He noticed immediately that something was wrong. The staff moved differently, quieter, tense. His wife avoided his eyes, and his son looked thinner, restless. "What happened while I was away?" Bright asked during dinner. "Nothing of importance," Safia replied smoothly. Bright's gaze shifted to Mukhtar. "Is that so?" Mukhtar nodded. "Just work." But that night, Bright couldn't sleep. Something gnawed at him. He stepped out onto the balcony, looking over the city lights. He controlled the lives he influenced. His phone buzzed. It was Kwame Boateng. Sir Kwame said hesitantly, "There's something you need to know. I wasn't sure whether to tell you, but I believe you should hear it from me." Bright's voice hardened. "What is it?" "There was an incident at New Dawn Public Hospital," Kwame said, "involving one of our former staff members." Bright frowned. "Former staff, yes. A young woman named Janet Akinyi. She was dismissed suddenly." Bright's heart skipped. "Dismissed?" Why, Kwame paused. "She was pregnant, sir, with twins." Silence. "And your son," Kwame continued carefully, "was seen at the hospital." Bright gripped the balcony railing, his knuckles turning white. "What happened to the children?" he asked. Kwame swallowed. "They didn't survive." Bright closed his eyes. In that moment, the world he had built carefully, proudly shifted beneath his feet. He did not yet know the full truth. He did not yet understand the depth of his son's cruelty. But something inside him stirred. And far away in a dark, cramped room, Janet Akinyi lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her body empty, her heart shattered. She did not know it yet. But the night she lost her twins was the night karma began to turn its gaze not toward her, but toward the man who believed power made him untouchable. The days after the hospital blurred together for Janet Akinyi like a long gray dusk that refused to end. Her body healed slowly, painfully. But her heart felt hollow, as if something essential had been torn out and never replaced. She woke up every morning expecting to feel movement in her stomach, expecting a reminder that she was not alone. Each time she remembered the truth, it felt like losing them all over again. Zuri Otieno tried her best to keep life moving. She brought food when she could, thin porridge, boiled cassava, sometimes a single orange split carefully in two. She talked constantly, filling the small room with noise, hoping sound might keep the silence from swallowing Janet whole. But Janet barely responded. She sat for hours staring at the wall, her hands resting on her flat stomach, her eyes empty. Pastor Daniel Mwangi visited often. He never forced conversation. Sometimes he simply sat on the floor beside her and prayed quietly. Other times he spoke gently, reminding her that grief had no timetable. One day he said softly, "The pain will breathe differently. It won't disappear, but it will stop crushing you." Janet nodded, though she didn't believe him. At night when Zuri slept, Janet cried silently into her pillow so no one would hear. She replayed everything over and over, the first smile, the first lie, the first moment she trusted Mukhtar Ofori. "I should have known," she whispered to the darkness. "I should have known." But blame did nothing to warm the room. It did nothing to fill her empty arms. Outside, the slum life continued without pause. At the Ofori mansion, Madame Sophia hosted guests again. Laughter returned to the halls. Expensive cars lined the driveway. To the world, nothing had changed. Mukhtar Ofori returned to his routines as well. Nights out, business meetings, loud dinners where his name still carried weight. People still treated him like the future of the Ofori Empire. But something had shifted inside him. Sleep no longer came easily. When it did, it brought dreams he couldn't control. Hospital lights, blood-stained sheets, a woman's voice whispering his name. He woke up sweating, his chest tight, his heart racing. He told himself it was stress. He told himself it was over. Yet every time he passed a hospital, his jaw clenched. Every time he heard a baby cry in public, irritation flared in him for no clear reason. He avoided his father. Bright Ofori, meanwhile, could not shake the information Kwame Boateng had given him. The image of a young woman dismissed and discarded haunted his thoughts. He prided himself on running his business with discipline and order. Scandals were bad for reputation, cruelty was bad for legacy, and yet, something deeper disturbed him. He requested Janet Akinyi's employment file. When it arrived thin and unremarkable, he flipped through it slowly. 2 years of service, no complaints, no warnings, then suddenly terminated. Reason misconduct. Bright frowned. What misconduct, he muttered. He called Kwame immediately. Find out everything he said. Quietly, while power moved behind closed doors, Janet struggled simply to survive. Her strength had not returned. She couldn't work. Even walking long distances left her dizzy. Zuri covered their rent by doing extra cleaning jobs, but it wasn't enough. One afternoon, the landlord knocked. You're behind again, he said bluntly. I can't keep waiting, Zuri pleaded. Just give us one more week. The man shook his head. 1 week, then you're out. That night, Janet sat up suddenly, her eyes clear for the first time in days. I can't keep doing this to you, she said to Zuri. You didn't choose this. Zuri frowned. Stop talking like that. I mean it, Janet continued. I need to stand again, even if it hurts. The next morning, Janet forced herself to leave the room. She walked slowly through the slum, past children playing in the dust, past women selling vegetables, past men sitting idly with tired eyes. She felt exposed, weak, but also strangely alive. She went to the small community center run by Pastor Daniel. I need something to do, she told him quietly. Anything. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. We need help teaching the girls basic skills. Sewing, reading. It won't pay much. Janet nodded. I don't care. For the first time since the hospital, she felt useful. Working with the girls hurt in ways she hadn't expected. Seeing their small hands, their innocent laughter, it reopened wounds she had tried to seal shut, but it also gave her something else purpose. At night, she came home exhausted but calmer, and slowly, very slowly, something inside her began to mend. Meanwhile, the truth was catching up to Mukhtar. Kwame Boateng uncovered hospital records, witness statements, Nurse Abena Mensah's report, Dr. Kofi Adams' refusal to falsify documents. The pattern was impossible to ignore. He compiled everything carefully and brought it to Bright Afori. Bright listened in silence. When Kwame finished, the room was quiet. Did he force her? Bright asked finally. Kwame hesitated. He threatened her. He pressured her. He used his position. Bright closed his eyes. For the first time in years, anger, not business frustration, but something personal, rose in his chest. That girl lost her children, Bright said slowly. And my son walked away. Yes, sir. Bright stood. I want to meet her. Kwame looked startled. Sir, I want to hear her voice, Bright said firmly. Find her. Across the city, Janet sat with the girls at the community center teaching them how to thread needles when a man approached the doorway. He was well-dressed, serious, out of place. Is Janet Akini here? He asked. Janet's heart skipped. Yes, she said cautiously. That's me. My name is Kwame Boateng, he said. I work for Mr. Bright Afori. The room seemed to tilt. What does he want? Janet asked quietly. Kwame met her eyes. He wants to speak with you. Fear surged through her, sharp and immediate. Old wounds reopened, old threats echoed in her mind. I have nothing to say to that family, she replied. Kwame nodded respectfully. I understand. But this is different. Janet hesitated. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she took a slow breath. Tell him, she said softly, that if he truly wants the truth, I will not hide it. She didn't know why she agreed. Maybe it was courage, maybe exhaustion, maybe fate. But as Kwame walked away, Janet felt something shift in the air. The story she had tried to bury was not finished, and somewhere far above the slums and the pain, karma was drawing closer, step by deliberate step, to the man who believed power could silence everything. When Kwame Boateng left the community center, Janet Akini stood frozen for several minutes, her hands still holding a piece of cloth she had been teaching the girls to sew. The laughter around her faded into a distant hum. One sentence echoed again and again in her mind. Bright Afori wants to speak with you. The name carried weight, power, money, fear. It belonged to the world that had chewed her up and spit her out, the world she had barely survived. That night, Janet barely slept. Zuri noticed immediately. You're shaking, she said, pulling the thin blanket tighter around them. What happened? Janet hesitated, then told her everything. Zuri sat up sharply. You don't have to go, I know, Janet replied. But if I don't, he'll always control the story. Zuri's voice softened. And what if he tries to silence you? Janet stared at the ceiling. Then at least I'll know I didn't stay silent. Across the city, Mukhtar Afori sensed the ground shifting beneath him. He noticed it in small ways at first. A canceled meeting, a delayed phone call, a look from Kwame that lingered a little too long. His father had become distant watchful. One evening, Mukhtar confronted Kwame directly. "You've been busy," he said, casually swirling his drink, "digging into old things." Kwame met his gaze without flinching. "Old things have a way of becoming current, sir." Mukhtar's jaw tightened. "Be careful." Kwame nodded. "I always am." That night, Mukhtar paced his room, anger rising with every step. He had handled everything, hadn't he? Paid who needed paying, threatened who needed threatening. The girl had disappeared into the slums. The babies were gone. So why did it feel like the past was breathing down his neck? The next morning, his phone buzzed. "Father wants to see you. Now." Mukhtar felt a chill run through him. In Bright Ofori's office, the air was heavy with silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, but Bright did not look outside. His attention was fixed entirely on his son. "Sit," he said. Mukhtar obeyed. "How long?" Bright asked slowly. "Have you been lying to me?" Mukhtar forced a laugh. "I don't know what you mean." Bright placed a thin folder on the desk and slid it forward. Mukhtar recognized the hospital letterhead immediately. His throat went dry. "You went to New Dawn Public Hospital." Bright continued, his voice calm but deadly. "You pressured a former staff member. She was pregnant, with twins." Mukhtar swallowed. "Father, she's exaggerating." Bright slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough!" The sound echoed like a gunshot. "She lost those children," Bright said, his voice low. "And you walked away." Mukhtar stood abruptly. "She was a mistake, a risk. You don't understand how fragile reputation is." Bright rose slowly to his feet. "No," he said. "You don't understand what you've done." Mukhtar's anger flared. "You taught me to protect this family at all costs." Bright's eyes burned. "I taught you discipline, not cruelty." For the first time, Mukhtar felt something close to fear. Outside that office, the city moved as always, unaware that a reckoning had begun. 2 days later, a black car arrived at the edge of the slum. Neighbors watched curiously as Janet Akinyi stepped out, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her simple dress. Zuri squeezed her hand before she left. "Whatever happens," Zuri said, "remember who you are." Janet nodded. The Ofori mansion looked even larger than she remembered. The gates opened slowly, silently, like a mouth swallowing her whole. Inside, Bright Ofori waited alone. He stood when she entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Bright bowed his head slightly. "I owe you an apology," he said. Janet stiffened. She hadn't expected that. "For what my household did?" Bright continued. "For what my son did. For what I failed to see." Janet's chest tightened. "Your apology won't bring my children back." Bright closed his eyes. "I know," she told him everything. She spoke of the loneliness, the promises, the pressure, the fear, the hospital room, the blood, the silence afterward. Bright listened without interruption. When she finished, he looked older, smaller. "My son will face consequences," he said quietly, "legally, socially, financially." Janet studied his face. "I don't want revenge." Bright nodded. "Then what do you want?" She took a deep breath. "I want him to understand that power does not erase responsibility." Bright exhaled slowly. "He will." That night, Mukhtar received the news he had been dreading. He was suspended from all company operations. His accounts were frozen. An internal investigation had begun. He stormed into his father's office, rage blazing in his eyes. "You're destroying me." Bright met his gaze steadily. "No, you destroyed yourself." Mukhtar laughed bitterly. Over a Maid, Bright's expression hardened. "Over 2 lives." The words hit harder than Mukhtar expected. Days later, the media caught wind of the investigation. Whispers became headlines. The Ofori name, once untouchable, was now tied to scandal. Mukhtar's friends stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. Doors closed. And one morning, as he sat alone in his luxury apartment staring at a television that replayed his downfall on loop, Mukhtar Ofori finally understood something he had never learned before. Power could protect you for a while, but karma did not care how rich you were, and it had only just begun. The city woke up to whispers before it woke up to headlines. At first, it was just murmurs passed between drivers and vendors, between office assistants and security guards. A powerful name spoken a little more carefully than usual, a rumor that carried weight because no one dared say it too loudly. Mukhtar Ofori. Investigation, hospital, Maid, twins. By midday, the whispers had teeth. Janet Akinyi did not own a television, but she didn't need one to know something had changed. She felt it in the way people looked at her when she walked through the slum, not with pity, not with suspicion, with curiosity. A woman selling vegetables leaned toward her neighbor and whispered. A young man paused mid-laugh when Janet passed by. Even the children grew quiet for a moment, sensing the shift in the air without understanding it. Zuri noticed it too. "They know," she said softly as they sat outside the room that evening. "I don't know how, but they know something." Janet wrapped her arms around herself. "I never wanted this kind of attention." Zuri studied her face. "This time the truth is louder than the lies." That same afternoon, Nurse Abena Mensah was called into the hospital administrator's office. She sat upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the administrator cleared his throat. "There have been inquiries," he said carefully, "about a patient you treated recently." Abena's heart pounded. She already knew who. "Janet Akinyi," she replied calmly. The administrator nodded. "We need a formal statement. Everything you witnessed." Abena took a deep breath. "I've been waiting for this." She told the truth, all of it, how Janet had arrived weak and frightened, how a powerful man had entered her ward uninvited, how papers had been pushed onto a bleeding woman's bed, how pressure had filled the room like poison. When she finished, the administrator leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This matters." Across the city, Dr. Kofi Adam gave his own statement. He spoke plainly, professionally, without embellishment. He described medical facts, ethical violations, and emotional coercion. Together, their testimonies formed a wall Mukhtar Ofori could not buy his way through. At Ofori Holdings, the atmosphere turned icy. Employees whispered in elevators. Emails were copied too carefully. Meetings ended abruptly when Mukhtar's name was mentioned. For the first time, fear flowed downward from the top. Mukhtar felt it everywhere. He walked into a cafe one morning and the laughter stopped. A former friend crossed the street rather than greet him. His phone buzzed constantly, not with invitations, but with alerts. Ofori Air, under investigation for coercion and abuse of power. He smashed the phone against the wall. "This can't be happening," he muttered. He called his lawyers. They were calm, cautious. "You should prepare for formal charges," one of them said. Mukhtar laughed, hollow and sharp. "Charges for what words?" The lawyer paused. "For actions." That night, Mukhtar drank alone in his apartment, staring out over the city he once believed belonged to him. He replayed the past in fragments. Janet's quiet voice, her trembling hands, the hospital lights. For the first time, guilt tried to surface. He pushed it down. This is her fault, he told himself. She should have known her place. But the words sounded weaker each time he said them. 2 days later, Janet received a message that made her hands shake. "You are requested to appear at the district legal office to give a formal statement." She stared at the screen for a long time. Zuri read it over her shoulder. "You don't have to go alone." Janet nodded slowly. "I know." The building was intimidating, tall gray echoing with footsteps. Janet sat in a small room with a recorder on the table, her palms damp, her heart pounding. The official across from her spoke gently. "Take your time. Tell us what happened." And Janet did. She spoke of hope and fear, of pressure disguised as care, of power that made refusal dangerous. Her voice broke when she spoke of the twins. "They never had a chance," she said softly. When she finished, the room was silent. The official stopped the recorder. "Thank you," he said. "Your courage matters." Outside, Janet exhaled deeply. She felt lighter, not healed but no longer silent. Meanwhile, Bright Ofori made a decision that would send shockwaves through every circle his family moved in. He called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters when he stepped up to the podium. Flashes went off, pens hovered. Bright Ofori did not smile. "My family name has been built on discipline, responsibility, and respect," he said. "Recent events have shown a failure on my part and on my son's." The room went still. "I will not protect wrongdoing." Bright continued, "No matter who commits it." A reporter raised a hand. "Are you referring to your son, Mukhtar Ofori?" "Yes," Bright replied without hesitation. Gasps rippled through the room. "I have removed him from all positions within Ofori Holdings. I am cooperating fully with the investigation, and I will personally ensure that justice is not obstructed." Across the city, Mukhtar watched the press conference in disbelief. His father's voice felt like a knife. You betrayed me, Mukhtar whispered to the screen. In that moment he realized something terrifying. He was alone. The following week, formal charges were filed: coercion, abuse of power, emotional and psychological harm. The words felt unreal when Mukhtar read them on paper. He had always believed laws bent for men like him, but this time they did not. Janet heard the news from Zuri, who burst into the room breathless. They charged him, Zuri said. It's real. Janet sat down slowly. She felt no joy, no victory, only a deep, quiet sadness for the lives lost, for the damage done. That evening, Pastor Daniel sat beside her. You spoke truth, he said. And truth moves slowly, but it moves. Janet nodded. I just hope it protects someone else. Days turned into weeks. Mukhtar's world continued to shrink. His accounts remained frozen. His passport was confiscated. His freedom, once absolute, now came with conditions. One night, unable to sleep, he found himself driving aimlessly through the city until he stopped outside New Dawn Public Hospital. He sat in the car, staring at the building. For the first time, he did not see a problem that needed to be erased. He saw consequences. And somewhere inside him, a question surfaced, small, unwanted, but persistent. Was it worth it? He did not yet know the answer. But karma, patient and relentless, was preparing to teach him. The courtroom was colder than Janet Akinyi expected, not in temperature but in feeling. The kind of cold that stripped warmth from the air and replaced it with tension, judgment, and waiting eyes. Wooden benches creaked under shifting bodies. A ceiling fan hummed softly, useless against the heaviness pressing down on everyone inside. Janet sat in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Zuri sat beside her, one arm protectively pressed against Janet's side. Pastor Daniel was behind them, silent and steady. Across the room, Mukhtar Ofori sat with his lawyers. He looked different. Not poor or money still clung to him in his tailored suit, his polished shoes, but diminished. The arrogance that once filled his posture had thinned, replaced by a tight jaw and restless movements. He avoided looking in Janet's direction, staring instead at the table in front of him, as if the wood might offer escape. When the judge entered the room, rose. Be seated. Janet's heart pounded so loudly she was sure others could hear it. This was it. Not closure, not yet, but the moment where silence officially ended. The prosecutor spoke first, outlining the charges: coercion, abuse of power, emotional manipulation. The language was formal, clinical, but Janet felt every word like a bruise pressed too hard. Then came the witnesses. Nurse Abena Mensah took the stand. Her voice was calm, unwavering. I saw a young woman in pain, she said, and a man who used fear instead of care. Dr. Kofi Adam followed, explaining medical facts, timelines, risks. He did not dramatize. He didn't need to. Janet listened, her nails digging into her palms. Then it was her turn. She stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her simple dress. For a moment the room seemed to spin. She took a breath and walked to the stand. State your name, the clerk said. Janet Akinyi, she replied. Do you swear to tell the truth? Yes. The prosecutor's questions were gentle but precise. Janet answered them one by one. She spoke of how she met Mukhtar, of the promises, the pressure, the fear of losing everything, the hospital room, the papers on the bed. Her voice cracked when she spoke of the twins. I felt them, she said softly. They were alive. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. When the defense cross-examined her, their tone sharpened. You accepted money from Mr. Ofori, didn't you? Janet swallowed. He offered it. I refused. You continued seeing him willingly. At first, she said, before I understood what power meant. Isn't it true, the lawyer pressed, that you are exaggerating now because you're angry? Janet lifted her head. Her eyes met the lawyer's steadily. I'm not angry, she said. I'm telling the truth. Something shifted in the room. When Janet stepped down from the stand, her knees nearly gave out. Zuri caught her, holding her tightly as they returned to their seat. You were brave, Zuri whispered. Janet closed her eyes. I was honest. The hearing lasted hours. By the time the judge adjourned for the day, the sky outside had darkened. No verdict yet, only the weight of what had been laid bare. As people filed out, Janet stood slowly, gathering her strength. She felt drained, exposed, but lighter. Then she sensed movement beside her. She turned. Mukhtar Ofori stood a few feet away. For a moment neither spoke. The space between them felt charged, heavy with everything unsaid. You didn't have to do this, Mukhtar said, finally, his voice low. Janet studied his face. She searched for remorse, for recognition. I did, she replied. His jaw tightened. You're enjoying this, watching me fall. Janet shook her head gently. No, I'm surviving. Something flickered in his eyes. Anger, confusion, something like shame. Then it vanished. This isn't over, he said. She met his gaze calmly. It never was. That night, Janet returned to the slum exhausted. Her body ached, her head throbbed. She lay on the mattress staring at the ceiling, listening to distant sounds, music, laughter, life continuing without her permission. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought dreams she couldn't escape. She was back in the hospital room. Bright lights, beeping machines, her stomach heavy again. She reached down, smiling, then the weight vanished. She woke up gasping, tears soaking her pillow. Zuri sat up instantly. Another dream. Janet nodded, pressing a hand to her chest. I keep thinking, if I had been stronger? Zuri shook her head. You were strong. He was cruel. Janet stared into the darkness. Strength didn't save them. The next morning, the news spread quickly. The hearing had shaken the city. Talk shows debated power and morality. Religious leaders spoke about accountability. Women whispered Janet's name like a secret, like a warning, and sometimes like hope. For the first time, Janet realized her story was no longer just hers. Meanwhile, Mukhtar's situation worsened. The court imposed stricter conditions. His movements were monitored. His remaining assets scrutinized. Sponsors withdrew. Friends disappeared. Even his mother, Madame Safia, avoided him now. You embarrassed this family, she said coldly when he confronted her. I warned you about crossing lines. Mukhtar stared at her in disbelief. You wanted her gone. Safia waved a dismissive hand. I wanted silence, not exposure. He left the mansion that night with nowhere to go that felt like home. Bright Ofori did not stop the investigation. He did not intervene. He did not soften the blow. Instead, he did something unexpected. He visited the community center. The girls stared wide-eyed as the tall, powerful man stepped inside. Janet stood frozen when she saw him. I won't stay long, Bright said quietly. I just wanted to see where you are. Janet nodded. This is my life now. Bright studied the room. The cracked walls, the donated books, the sewing machines patched together with care. You've built something meaningful here, he said. Janet met his eyes. It helps me breathe. Bright hesitated, then spoke. I've established a fund for women harmed by abuse of power. Your story, it will help shape it. Janet considered his words. If it protects someone else, she said, then yes. That night, as Janet walked home under a sky dusted with stars, she felt something unfamiliar settle inside her. Not peace, but resolve. The trial was not over. The pain was not gone. The memories would not fade overnight. But for the first time since the hospital, Janet felt like she was truly standing on her own feet, and somewhere in a silent apartment filled with luxury that no longer comforted him. Mukhtar Ofori stared at his reflection and saw a stranger. The man he had been was gone. The man he was becoming terrified him, and karma, relentless and exact, was still writing the next chapter. The waiting was worse than the trial itself. Janet Akinyi learned that as the days stretched into weeks, each one carrying the same quiet tension. The court had heard the evidence, the testimonies had been recorded, and now everything rested in a space she could not control. No matter how much courage she had found, no matter how loudly the truth had spoken, the outcome remained uncertain. Every morning she woke before dawn and walked to the community center. She cleaned the small rooms, arranged the sewing tools, and prepared lessons for the girls. Routine became her anchor. When her hands were busy, her mind had less room to wander back to hospital lights and blood-stained sheets. Still, some days were harder than others. One afternoon, as she taught a group of girls how to read simple sentences, one of them looked up and asked innocently, "Auntie Janet, do you have children?" The room went silent. Janet felt the air leave her lungs. She knelt beside the girl and forced a gentle smile. "I don't," she said softly. "But I love you all." The girl smiled back, satisfied. The others returned to their books. Janet turned away quickly, blinking back tears. Outside, the city buzzed with opinion. Radio shows debated morality and power. Some callers defended Mukhtar Ofori, claiming a man should not lose everything over a private matter. Others spoke with fury, demanding accountability. Janet's name was mentioned often, sometimes with respect, sometimes with doubt. She tried not to listen. Zuri, however, could not escape it. One evening she burst into their room, her face flushed with anger. "They're saying you planned this," she said, "that you wanted money, fame." Janet sat quietly on the mattress. People always need a story that makes them comfortable. Zuri clenched her fists. It's not fair. Janet nodded. Fairness is not promised, only truth. Meanwhile, Mukhtar Ofori's world continued to shrink. His lawyers spoke in cautious tones, now no longer confident. The court had rejected several motions. His attempts to delay proceedings had failed. Each day brought new restrictions, new losses. He moved out of his luxury apartment and into a smaller place arranged by his legal team. His name, once a key, now felt like a liability. Late one night, he found himself driving without purpose, his hands tight on the steering wheel. He passed familiar streets clubs. He used to frequent restaurants where his presence once commanded respect. Now, no one recognized him. The anonymity was suffocating. He parked near a small bar and went inside, ordering a drink he barely tasted. The television behind the counter played a talk show. This case has become a symbol, the host said. Not just of one man's actions, but of a system that allowed them. Mukhtar turned away. He thought of his father, Bright Ofori, who had not called him in weeks. Their last conversation echoed painfully in his mind. "You don't understand what you've done." For the first time, Mukhtar wondered if that was true. Bright, for his part, had aged visibly. The scandal had shaken him more deeply than he admitted. He attended every board meeting, every legal briefing with the same calm exterior, but at night, alone in his study, he replayed Janet's words over and over. "Your apology won't bring my children back." He had built an empire on control, believing structure could prevent chaos. Now he saw the flaw in that belief. Control without compassion bred monsters. He summoned Kwame Boateng late one evening. "The foundation," Bright said. "I want it operational immediately." Kwame nodded. "For women affected by abuse of power." "Yes," Bright replied. "And I want Janet Akinyi involved, not as a symbol, as a voice." Kwame hesitated. "She may refuse." Bright nodded slowly. "She has every right to." When Kwame approached Janet with the proposal, she listened carefully. "I don't want to be used," she said plainly. "You won't be," Kwame replied. "You'll have authority." Janet considered it overnight. By morning, she had made her decision. "If my experience can protect someone else," she said, "then I will help." The announcement of the foundation drew attention, but Janet stayed away from cameras. She worked quietly, meeting counselors, organizing resources, speaking privately to women who came with stories heavy in their throats. Each story chipped away at her pain, replacing it with purpose. Then, one afternoon, the call came. Zuri answered the phone first. Her eyes widened. She covered the receiver and whispered, "It's the court." Janet stood slowly, her heart pounding. The verdict would be delivered in 2 days. Those 2 days felt endless. On the morning of the verdict, the courtroom was full again. Reporters packed the back rows. Security stood alert. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Janet sat straight, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. Zuri squeezed her fingers. Mukhtar entered late, flanked by his lawyers. He looked thinner, older. His eyes flicked briefly toward Janet, then away. The judge entered. The room rose. The judge's voice was measured, deliberate. He summarized the case, the evidence, the testimonies. Janet listened, barely breathing. Then came the words that would change everything. Based on the evidence presented, the court finds the defendant guilty of coercion and abuse of power. A collective gasp filled the room. Janet closed her eyes. Mukhtar's shoulders slumped. His lawyer whispered urgently, but the words seemed to bounce off him. The judge continued outlining penalties, restrictions, consequences. They sounded distant to Janet, as if spoken underwater. When it was over, people stood slowly, murmuring, reacting. Janet remained seated for a moment, her body heavy with emotion. Zuri hugged her tightly. "It's over," she whispered. Janet shook her head gently. "It's only beginning." As she stood to leave, she felt a presence behind her. Mukhtar was there. He looked at her, not with anger this time, but something raw, unsettled. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said quietly. Janet studied him for a long moment. "I did," she replied. He opened his mouth to speak again, then closed it. There were no words left that mattered. Janet turned away. Outside, the sun shone brightly, indifferent to human drama. Janet stepped into its warmth, breathing deeply. She had not won. She had not regained what she lost, but she had reclaimed something else, her voice. And as she walked forward, surrounded by the noise of a city learning a difficult lesson, karma settled firmly into place, no longer a promise, but a reality that could not be undone. The verdict did not bring silence. It brought noise, loud, relentless, impossible to escape. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed forward, microphones, raised voices overlapping. Flashing cameras lit up the steps like sudden lightning. Janet, Janet. How do you feel? Do you believe justice was served? What do you say to people who still defend him? Janet Akinyi paused. For a moment she considered walking past them all. She was tired. Her body still carried scars no one could see, and her heart had learned to protect itself with careful distance. But then she remembered the women who had sat across from her at the foundation, the ones who whispered their stories as if truth itself might punish them. She turned. "I don't feel victorious," she said calmly. "I feel responsible. This isn't about destroying a man, it's about ending a pattern." The crowd quieted. "I lost my children," she continued. "Nothing will ever replace them. But if this moment stops even one person from using power to silence another, then it matters." She stepped away, then ignoring further questions. Inside a black car, Mukhtar Ofori sat rigidly staring straight ahead as his lawyer spoke in a low voice. "We'll appeal," the lawyer said. "This isn't the end." Mukhtar did not respond. His mind replayed the judge's words over and over. Guilty, abuse of power, coercion, words he had never imagined applied to him. As the car pulled away, he caught a glimpse of Janet through the window, standing tall, surrounded by people, her expression steady. Something twisted painfully in his chest. That night, Mukhtar returned to the small apartment arranged by his legal team. It felt temporary, lifeless. No art on the walls, no laughter, no sense of belonging. He poured himself a drink, then didn't touch it. His phone buzzed, a message from his mother. "Don't contact me again. You've ruined us." He dropped the phone onto the table. For the first time in his life, there was no one left to blame. Across the city, Janet sat quietly with Zuri on the roof of their building, watching the sun sink into orange and purple. "You were incredible today," Zuri said softly. Janet shook her head. "I was honest," Zuri smiled. "That's what makes it powerful." They sat in silence for a while. "Do you ever think about them?" Zuri asked gently. Janet's hand rested instinctively on her stomach. "Every day, but not like before," Zuri continued. Janet nodded slowly. "Before it was pain. Now, it's memory." The next weeks moved quickly. The foundation expanded. Counselors were hired. Safe spaces opened in communities that had never had them before. Women came quietly at first, then more openly, bringing stories that mirrored Janet's in frightening ways. Each time Janet listened, she felt both heartbreak and resolve. "This is why your voice matters," Bright Ofori told her during a meeting. Janet met his gaze. "This is why power needs witnesses." Bright accepted that without argument. Behind the scenes, Bright made another decision. He sold several luxury properties and redirected the funds into community housing and legal aid programs. The board questioned him. Shareholders protested. He did not waver. "I protected the wrong things for too long," he said. "I won't do it again." The media took notice. Some praised him, others accused him of damage control. Janet watched from a distance, detached. This was no longer about redemption for powerful men. It was about rebuilding broken systems. Meanwhile, Mukhtar's appeal process dragged on, slow and exhausting. He was ordered to attend mandatory counseling as part of his sentence. At first, he resisted sitting in silence during sessions, arms crossed, jaw clenched. But the counselor did not push. Power. She said one day doesn't mean control over others. It means responsibility for impact. Mukhtar scoffed. "That sounds poetic." "It's practical," she replied calmly, "and unavoidable." One afternoon, she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Have you ever said their names out loud?" Mukhtar frowned. "Who's the twins?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had never named them, had never allowed himself to imagine them as anything more than a problem. The realization left him shaken. That night he dreamed of a hospital room he had avoided for months. This time Janet was not screaming, she was silent, and the silence crushed him more than sound ever could. He woke up gasping, his chest tight, his eyes burning. Something had broken open. A month later, Janet received a message she hadn't expected. "I need to speak with you, not as a defendant, as a human being." The message was unsigned. She knew who it was. Janet stared at the screen for a long time. Zuri watched her carefully. "You don't owe him anything." "I know," Janet replied, "but this isn't about owing." They agreed on a public place, neutral, safe. When Janet arrived, Mukhtar was already there, sitting stiffly at a corner table. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of confidence, of certainty. She sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, Mukhtar said finally. I know I don't deserve it. Janet studied him quietly. I didn't understand, he continued, his voice low. I thought consequences were things that happened to other people. Janet said nothing. I see it now, he said. What I did, what it cost. She took a slow breath. Understanding doesn't undo harm, I know, he replied. But I needed you to hear it. Janet met his eyes steady and calm. The hardest part, she said, is not what you took from me. It's what you tried to take from my voice. Mukhtar swallowed hard. You didn't succeed, she continued. That's why you're here, and I'm not hiding. Silence stretched between them. When Janet stood to leave, Mukhtar spoke again. What do you call them? He asked softly. She paused. I call them hope, she replied, because they changed everything. She walked away without looking back. That night, Janet sat alone at the community center long after everyone had gone home. She lit a small candle and placed it near the window. For you, she whispered. Outside, the city hummed with life imperfect, noisy, moving forward. And somewhere within it, karma had finished its loud work. What remained now was quieter. Healing. The day Mukhtar Ofori was taken into custody did not look dramatic from the outside. There were no flashing sirens, no shouting crowds, no cameras waiting at the gate, just a quiet knock at the door of his small apartment early in the morning, while the city was still waking up. Mukhtar opened the door already knowing why they were there. Two officers stood calmly, respectfully. One read the order aloud. The words sounded official. Distant, unreal violation of conditions. Enforcement of sentence, immediate custody. Mukhtar nodded slowly. I'll get my jacket, he said. As he stepped back inside, he looked around the room. There was very little to take in. A narrow bed, a small table, no photographs, no memories worth packing. For the first time in his life, he left a place without leaving anything behind. At the correctional facility, the gates closed with a sound that echoed deeper than steel. Mukhtar felt it in his chest. The air smelled different, stale, heavy with resignation and routine. His shoes were taken, his watch removed, his name replaced with a number. He had spent his life believing rules bent for him. Here they did not. The first nights were the hardest. Sleep came in fragments interrupted by unfamiliar sounds, doors clanging, voices murmuring, the distant cough of another man who could not rest. Mukhtar lay on his narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, his mind restless, his body tense. He thought of his father's office, the leather chair, the view of the city, all the spaces that once opened for him without question. Now, space itself felt like punishment. Around him were men whose stories he had never cared to know. Some watched him with curiosity, others with indifference, a few with thinly veiled resentment once they learned his name. You thought money made you different, one man said quietly during mealtime. It doesn't in here. Mukhtar said nothing. He began attending the mandatory counseling sessions again, this time inside the facility. The counselor asked the same questions. This time, Mukhtar did not scoff. What do you feel now? She asked. Small, he replied honestly. That's not punishment, she said. That's awareness. Days passed, then weeks. Mukhtar's anger burned itself out, leaving behind something heavier: regret. Not regret for losing comfort, not regret for losing status, but regret for the moment he had chosen silence over humanity. At night he dreamed of twins he had never allowed himself to imagine, two small faces he could not see clearly, two cries he never heard. He woke up sweating, his heart pounding. For the first time, he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, quiet tears that soaked into the thin pillow before he wiped them away in shame. Across the city, Janet Akinyi felt a shift she could not explain. She was at the community center helping a young woman fill out paperwork for legal aid when a sudden heaviness passed through her chest. She paused, pressing her hand over her heart. You okay? The woman asked. Janet nodded slowly. Yes, just tired. But that night, as she sat alone by the window, she learned the truth. Zuri read the news aloud, her voice steady. Mukhtar Ofori has been taken into custody following violations of court conditions. Janet closed her eyes. She felt no satisfaction, no relief, only a deep, quiet finality. It's done, Zuri said softly. Janet nodded. Yes. The next morning, Janet went to the foundation office earlier than usual. She cleaned the desks, arranged the chairs, and prepared tea for the counselors. Routine grounded her. But as the day went on, something unexpected happened. Women began arriving more than usual. Some came quietly, some came crying, some came angry. They spoke of bosses who threatened them, men who used money as a weapon. Silence bought with fear. Janet listened. Every story strengthened her resolve. This doesn't end with one man, she said during a staff meeting. It ends when systems change. The foundation expanded its legal partnerships. Workshops were held in communities that had never had access to them. Word spread. Janet's name became associated not with scandal, but with courage. Bright Ofori watched it all unfold from a distance. He visited the correctional facility once. Mukhtar was brought into the room thinner, quieter. The silence between father and son was thick. "You didn't come to save me," Mukhtar said finally. "No," Bright replied. "I came to witness." Mukhtar lowered his eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness." Bright nodded. "Nor should you, but you should expect responsibility." They sat in silence for a long time. When Bright stood to leave, Mukhtar spoke again. "She called them hope," he said quietly. Bright paused at the door. "Then learn what hope demands." That night, Bright returned home to an empty mansion that no longer felt like victory. He sat in his study thinking not of wealth, but of legacy. He began drafting documents, long-term commitments, irreversible decisions, wealth redirected, power redistributed, not as punishment, as repair. Meanwhile, Janet received an invitation she did not expect. A women's rights conference wanted her to speak. She hesitated. "I'm not a speaker," she told Zuri. Zuri smiled. "You're a survivor. That's enough." At the conference, Janet stood before a room filled with faces from different walks of life. Activists, professionals, survivors. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the microphone. "I was once told I didn't get to want things anymore," she began. The room grew quiet. "But I learned something," she continued. "Wanting dignity is not rebellion, it's a right." Applause filled the room, not loud but steady, affirming. That night, Janet returned home exhausted but fulfilled. She lit the candle again by the window. "For you," she whispered once more. In the correctional facility, Mukhtar lay awake on his bunk staring at the ceiling. The world he had known was gone. The man he had been no longer existed. In its place stood someone broken but awake. Karma had struck, not with chaos, but with truth. And for the first time, Mukhtar understood that punishment was not the loss of freedom, it was the loss of ignorance. Healing did not arrive as a single moment for Janet Akinyi. It came in fragments, quiet, uneven pieces stitched together by routine service and time. Some days felt light, almost normal. Others reopened wounds she thought had sealed. Janet learned not to measure progress by happiness, but by resilience. She woke before sunrise as she always had, but now her mornings were different. Instead of rushing to a mansion that never felt like home, she walked to the foundation office, keys warm in her palm, purpose steady in her chest. The building was modest, painted walls, borrowed furniture, donated supplies, but it held something rare: safety. Women came early, often before the city fully stirred. Some arrived alone. Others came with children clinging to their skirts. Janet greeted each one with the same calm respect she had once wished for herself. "Sit," she would say gently. "Take your time." She listened more than she spoke. There was a young woman who had been threatened by her supervisor, a mother whose landlord demanded favors instead of rent, a student whose scholarship sponsor believed kindness came with conditions. Janet recognized the fear in their eyes, the hesitation before truth, the shame that never belonged to them. "We'll walk this together," she told them. And for the first time in her life, those words were not a hope, they were a promise. Zuri noticed the change. "You're stronger," she said one evening as they shared a simple meal. "Not hard, just grounded." Janet smiled faintly. "I had to become someone my past couldn't break." Still, nights remained difficult. Some evenings after the center closed and the city quieted, Janet sat alone by the window. She lit the candle and let her thoughts wander where they needed to go. She spoke softly to the memory of the twins, not with guilt anymore, but with love. "I'm still here," she whispered, "and I'm doing something with what you gave me." At the correctional facility, Mukhtar Ofori's days followed a strict rhythm: wake, count, work, eat, sleep. He had been assigned to a workshop where inmates repaired old furniture. At first he resisted the work. His hands blistered, his back ached. He was unused to labor that did not bend to his will. An older inmate noticed his frustration. "Furniture doesn't care who you were," the man said quietly, "only how you treat it now." Something in that sentence lodged in Mukhtar's mind. He began to work more carefully, sanding slowly, measuring twice, repairing broken joints instead of replacing them entirely. There was something humbling about restoring what had been damaged instead of discarding it. During counseling, he spoke more openly. "I thought silence was control," he said one day. "Now I see it was fear." The counselor nodded. "What do you fear now?" Mukhtar hesitated, becoming someone who knows better and does nothing. That fear stayed with him. Bright Ofori watched both lives unfold from a distance, his own transformation quieter, but no less significant. He attended fewer galas. He declined interviews. He spent more time reviewing policies, meeting with community leaders, listening. At a board meeting, a member questioned the continued funding of legal aid programs. "Isn't this excessive?" the man asked. "The scandal has passed." Bright looked at him calmly. "Justice doesn't expire." The room fell silent. He visited the foundation occasionally, not as a patron but as a participant. He sat in workshops. He listened to survivors speak. He never interrupted. When he did speak, it was measured and rare. "I am learning," he said once. "That leadership without accountability is just entitlement in a suit." Janet appreciated his restraint. One afternoon she received a letter. It was handwritten, the paper plain, the words careful. "I'm not asking you to reply," it began. "I only want you to know that I am listening now, and I am learning how much damage silence can do. I will spend the rest of my life trying not to repeat it." There was no signature. Janet folded the letter slowly. She did not feel anger. She did not feel obligation. She placed it in a drawer and closed it gently. That evening, a new program launched at the Foundation, vocational training for women rebuilding their lives. Janet stood at the front of the room as the first group gathered. "You are not here because you are broken," she told them. "You are here because you are becoming." Applause followed, not loud, but full. Weeks turned into months. Janet's health improved. Her strength returned. Laughter came more easily. She found joy in small things, shared meals, completed projects. The quiet pride of watching someone else stand taller than they had before. One afternoon, a young woman approached her hesitantly. "I was told you lost children," the woman said softly. "How do you keep going?" Janet took a breath. "I let grief change me," she replied. "But I didn't let it decide who I would become." The woman nodded, eyes shining. At the correctional facility, Mukhtar completed a restorative justice program. Part of it required writing a statement not for release, not for sympathy, but for clarity. He wrote slowly. He wrote about entitlement, about fear, about the moment he realized that harm could be quiet and still be devastating. When he finished, he folded the paper and placed it in an envelope addressed to no one. It was not meant to be sent. It was meant to be remembered. One evening, after a long day, Janet walked home beneath a sky brushed with stars. The city hummed softly around her cars, passing music drifting from a nearby house, voices rising and falling. She felt present, fully present. Zuri waited for her on the steps. "There's a celebration at the center tomorrow," Zuri said. "First graduates from the program." Janet smiled. "I'll bring tea." They laughed together, the sound easy and real. That night, Janet lit the candle once more, but this time she didn't sit in silence. She spoke aloud, her voice steady. "Thank you," she said, "for staying with me." The flame flickered, then steadied. Somewhere behind walls of concrete and steel, Mukhtar lay awake, not in anguish, not in denial, but in reflection. He did not dream of the past that night. He dreamed of hands restoring broken wood, of listening without speaking, of a future that demanded humility. And in the city beyond him, Janet Akinyi closed her eyes, knowing this much was true. She had not been saved. She had saved herself. The visit did not come as a surprise to Janet Akinyi, but it still required courage she had not needed in a long time. The letter arrived on a quiet morning, slipped under the door of the foundation office. No letterhead, no signature, just a request, formal, restrained, careful with every word. "A supervised meeting has been approved, if you consent." Janet read it twice, then a third time. She did not feel fear. That, more than anything, surprised her. Zuri watched her closely. "You don't have to go." Janet nodded. "I know. Then why are you thinking about it?" Janet folded the letter neatly. "Because closure isn't something you wait for. Sometimes you choose it." The correctional facility was quieter than she expected. Not silent, just controlled. Ordered. a place designed to keep everything contained, including regret. Janet walked through the security checks calmly, her steps steady, her breathing even. When she entered the visitation room, she saw him immediately. Mukhtar Ofori stood as she approached. He looked different again, not just thinner or older, but stripped of the sharp edges that once defined him. His shoulders were slightly rounded now, his gaze uncertain. He waited until she sat before sitting himself. For a moment, neither spoke. "I didn't think you'd come," he said finally. Janet met his eyes. "I didn't come for you." He nodded slowly. "Then for what?" She considered the question. "For the part of me that doesn't want to carry this anymore." Silence settled between them, heavy but not hostile. "I've had a lot of time to think," Mukhtar said. "Too much, maybe." Janet did not respond. "I used to believe consequences were things you avoided if you were smart enough," he continued. "I didn't understand that they were lessons." She watched him carefully. He was not asking for absolution. Not today. "I won't pretend to know your pain," he said, "but I know I caused it." Janet's voice was calm when she replied. "Knowing isn't the same as changing." He nodded. "I'm learning that." Another pause. "Do you hate me?" he asked quietly. Janet thought about it honestly. She searched her chest for the familiar ache, the anger that once lived there. "No," she said at last. "I don't." He looked surprised. "Hate keeps people connected," she continued. "I don't need that anymore." Mukhtar swallowed. "Then what do you feel?" resolved Janet replied. "And distance." He nodded, accepting it. They sat in silence again. The guard shifted near the door. "There's one thing I need to say," Mukhtar said, his voice low. Not to ask anything, just to say it. Janet inclined her head slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, "not for what happened to me, for what I did, for what I took." Janet held his gaze steadily. The hardest part, she said, softly echoing words she had spoken before, was realizing that you tried to erase my voice. Mukhtar's eyes filled. He blinked hard but didn't look away. "You didn't succeed," she continued. "That matters." She stood then, signaling the end. "Take care," he said quietly. Janet paused. "You too." She walked out without looking back. Outside, the air felt lighter, not because the past had changed, but because it no longer followed her. Weeks later, the foundation held a small gathering to mark its first year. There were no banners, no speeches meant for cameras. Just women seated in a circle sharing food and stories. Children ran between chairs laughing. Someone played soft music from a phone. Janet stood to speak unplanned, her voice steady. "This place exists because silence was broken," she said, "not by anger but by truth." Heads nodded, hands reached for one another. "We can't undo what was taken from us," she continued, "but we can decide what we become." Applause rose, gentle, affirming. Bright Ofori stood at the back, listening. He did not step forward. He did not claim credit. He understood now that repair meant restraint. That evening, Janet returned home as the sky turned gold. She lit the candle one last time, not in grief, not in ritual, but in gratitude. For the strength, she whispered. For the lesson. She did not need to say goodbye. Across the city, Mukhtar sat at a small desk in the facility's library reading. He had begun tutoring other inmates in basic skills reading writing patience. It was slow work, humbling work, necessary work. He no longer imagined redemption as applause or release. He understood it as responsibility, quiet, ongoing, earned. Janet's life continued forward. The foundation expanded its reach. New programs launched. New leaders emerged. Women who once arrived afraid now spoke with confidence. Janet stepped back, gradually mentoring instead of leading, allowing others to rise. One afternoon, a young woman approached her. "I want to help," she said, "but I'm scared." Janet smiled. "Then you're ready." That night, Janet stood by her window, listening to the city breathe. She thought of the road behind her, not to dwell, but to measure the distance traveled. She had lost, she had endured, she had built, and in doing so she had found something stronger than justice or revenge. She had found peace, not the quiet that forgets, but the quiet that understands. Life does not always punish cruelty immediately, and it does not always reward kindness loudly. But one truth remains unshaken. Every choice leaves a footprint on someone else's life, and eventually on our own soul. This story reminds us that power without empathy becomes a weapon, and silence in the face of injustice can be just as destructive as the act itself. Janet Akinyi did not win because she was stronger than others. She won because she refused to let pain erase her dignity. She chose truth over fear, purpose over bitterness, and healing over revenge. And in doing so, she transformed suffering into protection for others. Karma is not always dramatic. Sometimes it arrives quietly through accountability, loss of privilege, or the slow awakening of conscience. And healing is not forgetting what happened. Healing is remembering without being destroyed by it. If you've ever felt small, silenced, or powerless, remember this: your voice matters more than you think. Speaking the truth may not change the past, but it can change the future, yours and someone else's. Now we'd love to hear from you. What part of this story moved you the most? Do you believe karma always finds its way, even if it takes time? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. And if stories like this inspire you, comfort you, or remind you that humanity still matters, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that give voice to the unseen and hope to the unheard.